Howdy, on to chessboard number 5. This one is Purpleheart and a green epoxy, and I learned a great lesson to not cut corners with the table saw. Luckily, this lesson didn't even cost me an arm or leg, or a finger. Welcome to Howdies. I started as usual with a 16-inch by 16-inch base made out of 1/2-inch MDF. I traced the 2-inch squares onto the base and cut my Purpleheart pieces, 32 of them, into 2 by 2-inch squares. After my squares were cut, I laid them out in a pattern that I wanted with the best grain showing on the top. I then glued the Purpleheart squares down securely to the MDF base. With this board, I'm not doing a second wood for the top, and instead I'm just going to use epoxy to fill the 32 additional squares. So to reduce the risk of bubbles in the epoxy from any pores in the wood, I sealed the Purpleheart squares with a few layers of shellac spray. After the shellac dried, I mixed up a batch of epoxy and added a green pigment to it in hopes that the green pigment would complement the red tones of the Purpleheart. I placed the board into my epoxy jig, which is made out of HDPE, and began pouring the green epoxy into the alternating squares and onto the sides of the board. Note that I have a video on how to make these chessboard HDPE molds on my channel if you would like to check it out. After the epoxy was added, I weighted the board down and let it dry completely. Usually takes anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. Once the epoxy was dried, I removed the board from my HDPE mold by knocking off the side, then breaking the seal around the other sides and the bottom of the board. Once removed, I used my extremely slow drum sander to flatten the top of the board. As I've said in other videos, if you add enough epoxy to just come to the top of the height of the wood squares, you can minimize the time you'll spend at the drum sander itself, and thus minimize all of the epoxy dust. Once flattened, I use my table saw and sled to square up the edges of the board. Although my table saw works well for this step, I hope one day maybe I can add a edge sander, which could perform this step a little more easily and perhaps more safely. The next step was cutting up some of the remaining pieces of the Purpleheart into strips to use for the edging for the board. These strips were attached to the epoxy sides using CA glue and an accelerator. This method works well to attach the wood to the epoxy, but since it sticks immediately, I needed to take my time lining up the edges. Once they were attached, they would not move. Everything worked well up to this point. Then I got a little bit lazy trying to trim the overhanging pieces of the Purpleheart trim. I tried using my table saw and a makeshift miter, which would have maybe worked fine, except that I kept the saw on while I was positioning the board for the next cut. Moving quickly and being lazy around power tools is a recipe to ruin your work, or worse, ruin an appendage. Luckily, in this case, it was just the bottom of the board that took the brunt of the force. I fixed it later with some additional epoxy, filling in, and covered the underside with felt. Okay, moving on. Once the side trim is attached, I sanded both the top and the bottom of the board using my random orbital sander. I then added another few coats of shellac to seal the exposed wood on the top of the board, and I let that shellac dry completely. I mixed up a clear batch of epoxy for the top coat and poured it evenly over the top of the board. This gives the board a smooth, glossy, and protected top. I sanded down the epoxy drips from the bottom of the board and used mineral spirits to clean the entire board from any additional residue. I then taped off the wood edging on the bottom and sprayed Gorilla Glue on the bottom of the board to ready it to attach the felt. I cut a slightly oversized piece of felt and secured it to the Gorilla Glue on the bottom. Once secure, I used my metal ruler as a guide and a utility knife to trim the felt overhang from the four sides. At that point, the board was completed and ready for some chess pieces to be added. Hope you enjoy the build and hope to see you soon. Howdies out.